Chillin' like a villain. Chillin' like a villain.
You can find me in the space between.
Let's go, bring it on. Better give us what we want. It's the one for the crown. If you don't, it's going down. It starts with you and me.
Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and welcome to the DCOM review. After 2 years and what was probably a record amount of press and advertising for this channel, Descendants 2 is finally upon us. How good is it? Does it beat out the original? And does it live up to the massive hype? Well, let's discuss as we take a closer look at Descendants 2. We start things off as most Kenny Ortega movies do with a musical number, and it's pretty damn good. And the fact that it's all a dream sequence happening in Mal's mind actually does add context to what her character is going through right now. Speaking of right now, Descendants 2 is most definitely one of those sequels where to properly gauge it, you do need to be caught up on the events of the previous film to a degree. And assuming you have seen that film, almost everyone is back save Audrey because she pretty much served her purpose last time. But I do think as far as an introduction goes, or in this case a reintroduction, it works a little better than Rotten to the Core in the original, specifically because of the added context I mentioned, but more on that later. So, the current state of Auradon is that Ben is the king, and Mal is trying her best to adjust to the royal lifestyle. Mal is using her spellbook as a means to fit in, which is a problem for some reason. They do live in a world of magic, so I'm not sure why it would be. Also, the boys are back, and this new Jane Carlos romantic subplot is going exactly where you think it is. So apparently Mal and Ben are getting engaged to be engaged to be engaged? What? But it's as good a reason as any to have Mal struggling to come to terms with how much she really fits in at Auradon. People at Auradon love her now, but the central question then becomes, is it because of who she really is or who she's trying to be? It's a plot point we've seen done before, but because Descendants as a franchise is so predicated on handling social issues subtextually, this dilemma also works on that level too. But more on Mal when we break down the characters. Eventually, we get to fencing practice, except with real-ish swords. And then, from out of nowhere, the best subplot in the film. Lonnie was a completely wasted character in the original, and the way she was introduced 2 years ago was perfect symbolism for many of the original's worst aspects. But here, they get it right. In fact, this is how the original should have introduced her, more or less. The United States of Auradon, which could literally be called the USA, makes no attempts to hide the fact that it's a Disney-fied commentary on American society except with a monarchy. So, it makes perfect sense that in a world where some people think that all of our social issues are fixed or don't need fixing, i.e. Chad Charming and Audrey from the last movie, that an entire isle of disenfranchised people exist, or that sexism is still rampant. Those are still huge issues in both USAs. And having Mulan's daughter fight that? Oh, you bet your ass that's the perfect thing to do with specifically her character. Also, for some reason Chad went from a suave dick in the first film to a moron here, so make of that what you will. Then, we get another well done film reference, but this time to the Matrix and their famous See All Truth Red Pill. Unfortunately, the dog eats it and... What? No. No! 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 Why, Descendants, why? You were doing so well. But thankfully, that horrifying experience is easily forgotten thanks to the introduction of China Anne McClain's character, Uma. 2 songs in and I'm already convinced that Kenny O pulled the Cheetah Girls 2 and stepped up the sequel soundtrack in a huge way. China kills this, the choreography is pretty good all around, and hell, what else needs to be said? The song even kind of works on a narrative level, because we later learn that Uma feels forgotten about when she wasn't picked as part of Ben's expansion program. Now, everyone knows Mal's name, but nobody knows hers. Meanwhile, Ben finally realizes that Mal has been using magic to help her fit into Auradon. I get that because Ben got magically swindled into falling for her for a time in the original that he might not approve of Mal's magic now, but I mean, come on, this is blown way out of proportion. And in a way, Ben does eventually realize that too. Mal's been trying to keep up appearances for a while now, something Ben can't truly comprehend until, you guessed it, he experiences Mal's world firsthand. This was the best place to take Ben's character because you can't really be a good ruler unless you at least have a general understanding of the people you rule, which then leads to another really good song in Chillin' Like a Villain, a welcome change of pace song that takes a bit of obvious inspiration from the King of Pop himself, who Kenny Ortega has actually worked with. So, Ben finally confronts Mal, and Mal is adamant about not wanting to go back. which then leads to Ben's capture at the hands of Uma's henchmen. I know I didn't mention Dizzy yet, but we'll get to her a little later. So the VKs come up with a plan to get Ben back that involves Fairy Godmother's wand. Again. After Mal loses an arm wrestling contest? Sure, why not? So, while Jay and Carlos are printing a fake wand, Mal and Evie get a best friend song. Their first movie didn't really get the montage thing right, but it functions much better here, if only because Evie and Mal's best friend relationship is way easier to buy than Ben and Mal's romantic one to this point. The song itself is fine, and it adds another dimension to the soundtrack, but oh, we gotta talk about this Lonnie moment. She volunteers herself for a fight against an antagonist who could potentially take down a kingdom, literally forcing herself into a bigger role than she ever should have had, and does so despite the risks. I could cry. This is parallels and references done right. This is also probably the only time you'll hear me talking about a force fit and have it be a major positive. It makes sense and it's subtle, which is exactly how it should be done. And to this movie's credit, the references almost across the board are just downplayed enough to work. Save one really clumsy delivery from Gaston's son, they mostly fix the first movie's problem of hitting you over the head with Disney lore. And one great moment led to another, as Uma now confronts Ben about how his gracious plan had the unfortunate consequence of leaving many people out in the cold. Do I even need to explain why it's such a great social metaphor to have an economically downtrodden VK mad as hell at a privileged leader? For as selfless as Ben proves to be throughout 2 films, he doesn't really understand what's beyond his kingdom until he branches out and sees it for himself. Initially, it's all about saving Mal, but then he has to respect the fact that Uma kind of has a point, especially since Ben forgot to expand his Ordon Acceptance Proclamation after the original 4 managed to make it work, which would especially help the kids born into a bad situation who never did or never wanted to do anything wrong, and once again, the social subtext writes itself. And I would imagine that a Descendants 3 would continue pushing the socio-political envelope forward, and eventually have every Isle member convert if they want to, while those with too much pride in their evil heritage stay put. Essentially, just like how Camp Rock 2 ended, except more meaningful. But back to the plot. I think the movie does lose a bit of steam at this point though. I'm not really sure why they need to have a rap battle before making what could have been a very straightforward exchange. Lord knows Sophia is probably getting PTSD just listening to Dove attempt to match China's flow. Where's Brandon Michael Smith when you need him? And I think this movie improves by instead incorporating a musical track fully into the fight sequence that results instead of the build-up to said fight. Anyways, the kids eventually escape, have a talk to sort out their feelings, and Carlos does what we expected him to do. But because Mal dropped her spell book, they get to set up this overly obvious Ben's under a spell again moment with Uma, since that was literally the only thing that could have happened, and since we've seen Ben under a love spell before, all the supposed tension they build up with this scene flies right out the window. But, of course, true love's kiss breaks the spell. What a ham-fisted ending. Oh my... Oh, what? What's that? Do you hear that? Do you hear that? Ladies and gentlemen, what could that be? I'm thinking this isn't even their final forms.
What's he doing? Is to go even further beyond!
Uma turns into a super octopus, or close enough I guess, and Mal turns into a freaking dragon. Now, this movie is somewhat predictable in several respects, but never would I have ever predicted a kaiju fight as the climax of a DCOM. Given the fact that this is a TV movie budget, this is pretty awesome, and it's honestly what I was hoping the original would do more of. But Ben stands in between the two to quell the war because the only way his arc effectively resolves is to understand both sides a bit better and then do something about it, which he does. And then, we end things the way only Ortega can, with a big blowout dance sequence. You know how in several movies, characters get wet and then turn dry all of a sudden? It's such a big cliche that even Teen Beach Movie made fun of it. Well, here, they flip that script and instead use the water that's built up to facilitate the choreography, instantly creating one of the most visually innovative sequences in any DCOM. And now, let's talk characters. Let's all collectively agree that live-action talking dogs almost never work and move on. But thankfully, Disney's at times overplayed but mostly effective adorableness helps cancel it out. In many ways, she fills the role of audience stand-in character who would love nothing more than to be accepted into a world of magic and wonderment, something we can all relate to at one point or another, or even still can. This film did kind of make it overly clear what a resolution would be, but I think that's fine. Sometimes you just need a happy ending. The returning supporting characters save Lonnie don't have too much impact on the story though, but oddly enough, I was actually more entertained by Chad the Dimwit here versus the completely different Chad we got in the last movie. And with Uma filling in the role of antagonist, you don't really need Audrey filling up the space, so I don't really mind that she wasn't here physically. But man, did they ever get Lonnie right. This time around, she did make her mother proud. But there's not too much I need to explain beyond that. If you've seen Mulan, then you'll catch everything they did with her character and probably enjoy it. I was watching her fight, and I kid you not, the Mulan battle score was playing in my head while it happened. Even though the point of both movies is that being a descendant shouldn't completely define you, Lonnie's involvement here proves that it always somewhat will, which is a part of Mal's arc as well. Carlos and Jay once again don't have a ton of important screen time. In fact, the pair even point out how they often feel like Mal and Evie are always getting more of the spotlight, so the movie knows it too. But even still, there's just not much to say about them. Carlos eventually asks Jane out, as expected, and Jay learns to accept Lonnie, as expected. There is really nothing else to it. If anything, both Lonnie and Dizzy were more crucial to the overall narrative as supporting characters than either of these two were as main ones. Dove Cameron is once again solid here as Mal. Her arc comes with a lot more emotional weight this time, and she navigates it pretty well. This sequel is less about Mal herself as the first one was, and more about the idea behind what she's going through. The former Mal just wanted to be like her mother, but then, after she realizes she doesn't have to be that, she struggles with being a prototypical blonde princess sort. This franchise has always emphasized aesthetic, so naturally, this movie emphasizes Mal's many transformations by literally transforming her. It's a constant internal push and pull until she finally embraces the real her, no longer feeling trapped by any of her false personas. This was handled pretty well, but it's pretty easy to see where they were going with her character arc once the opening song finishes. So, on that level, this movie is far more carried by Ben, Uma, and even Evie to a degree. Evie is a more structurally important character here than in the first movie, not just because her friendship with Mal is even more important, but also because of what she represents that Mal doesn't. Evie has become the poster child for rejecting your past, admitting to yourself that it was always bad, and keeping your focus on the proverbial greener grass. She doesn't struggle at all with her former ways because she learned a bit of self-confidence in the first film, and because her life is objectively better now. But a crucial detail here is that while she rejects her old life, she doesn't forget about her old home. She just appreciates the chances that Auradon has granted her, which is why she was motivated to suggest bringing Dizzy over from the Isle as the next step in King Ben's master plan. She made it out of her situation, and now wants to give back to the kids who she relates to the most. There's literally 1,000 real-world examples of just that, but to name one, Denzel Washington. He was hanging out with the wrong crowd before pulling himself out of his situation to become one of the world's greatest actors. Both him and Evie were lucky enough to have been said yes to, lucky enough to find opportunity in addition to their hard work. Otherwise, Evie never would have moved, and Denzel never would have acted professionally. And both of them then used their position of influence to help others follow their own dreams, knowing that opening doors for people goes a long way, the importance of which is self-explanatory. King Ben proves that not all the guys in Descendants 2 are getting the short end of the stick. One of the most valuable traits you can have as a ruler or a leader is understanding those around you, the people that make up the backbone of everything you lead and or rule. Ben began that in the first movie by seeking a major change. In a move similar to Brown v. Board of Education, he opened up Auradon Prep to 4 villain kids, because he knew what even his parents didn't understand at the time, that everyone deserves a chance to succeed and to be accepted regardless of background. A lesson of immeasurable weight and importance, especially in today's taxing political and social climate. But no good deed goes unpunished, and just like in the real world, every seemingly great action will inevitably screw over someone, whether intentionally or not. This was the most sensible thing to do with Ben and his progressive stance, because even the best intentions have a price. And by hitting him over the head with a strong dose of this is real life outside your safe kingdom walls, he then begins to understand the Isle. He begins to understand Uma's anger, and he finally understands Mal's frustrations with fitting in. He learns, and as a leader, he'll only improve because of that mentality, in spite of his awkward dance moves. China Anne McClain does not disappoint in her role as Uma. She gave the sequel the added dimensions it needed, both narratively and musically. The whole magical love spell thing near the end wasn't memorable, but almost everything leading up to that was well done on her end. Again, she represents what Isle life is really like before and after Ben's proclamation. Despite that, she still managed to grow into an effective leader without Auradon's help. But, in her case, her life still involves stealing from people who can't really stop her. That's bad, but remember, some people have done way worse just to survive. When this is your life, You can justify almost anything, and it's easy to mistrust the higher-ups who don't seem to care about you even if they say they do. And I like that she clearly doesn't resolve right away. It would have been way too easy, and nothing about her character suggests that she's ready for a major metamorphosis just yet. And here's hoping that Descendants 3 eventually breaks into straight up class warfare, except on a larger scale, because first of all, it would be all too fitting into the grander social context of the franchise, second of all, it would kick ass as a movie scene, and third of all, the best way to finish resolving a character with as much pride as Uma is to show her the true cost of her aggression. All in all, China did really well here, and just like most of this movie, she was a step up from what came before her. And that's Descendants 2. So, what's the verdict? Descendants 2 defied my expectations coming into it and delivered a really good sequel. Calling this movie a step up from the original Descendants shouldn't be overly surprising given my analysis to this point, but the real questions are why and how. I was afraid that this movie would completely forget about the interesting ideas the subtext of the first tried and sometimes succeeded in incorporating, that this sequel would fall into the trap of giving us a bigger movie but not a better movie. But thankfully, neither fear was realized. It is a much bigger production, and the aesthetics of the world are still top tier for DCOMs. But instead of dropping the social issues tackled by the original, they expanded upon them, gave them room to be discussed, and made the most sensible choice for what would drive this antagonist so fervently. On the surface, it's Uma versus Mal, but underneath that, it's haves versus have-nots, a point made even more potent by the fact that Mal and her friends were picked to literally live fairy tale lives, while everyone else was left behind. This is the real conflict, and it's even more important than anything Mal is going through personally, because the bigger picture here is all about how Ben can effectively rule without understanding and reaching out to everyone he's ruling. Everything Ben has tried to do so far has been morally correct, but by challenging his limited perspective, the movie progresses him in ways vastly superior to the original. As the end song points out, changing the world starts with them, because even though Ordon is the land of opportunity, that doesn't make it perfect. Another thing that this movie does well is soundtrack and choreography. Kenny Ortega feels right at home here, choreographing with every nook and cranny he can find. Once again, using his mastery of space to create visually interesting numbers to go along with the music itself. The movie delves into a ton of environments and atmospheres, and the music speaks to that. Additionally, the overall level of acting is stepped up here. The timing and the ways the actors play off each other both seem better, which is definitely a result of increased chemistry. And I simply can't stress enough just how much I loved Lonnie's involvement here, one of the many aspects that could easily work as symbolism for everything this movie improved upon. Now, I know that it seems like I'm being overly praising of this movie and overly dismissive of the first, but there's a reason for it. The first was still pretty good, but there was a ton of problems with how they went about handling certain plot points as well as the subtext. So I don't think I'm overstating things one bit to express just how many things the sequel seemed to fix, almost in direct response to the legitimate points against the first installment. For example, in the first movie, the introductions were mostly obnoxious, but here, the kids made mostly subtle references to their parents as opposed to being annoyingly overt. But also, the reason I keep going back to Descendants is because this film really is part 2, more so than Descendants 2, which is a good thing. These movies are so tightly bound together that there is so much about the sequel that doesn't work on its own without the original providing context. Several of the main characters and the arcs they go through are perfect examples of just that, and it's better here than with other DCOM franchises because of how important the subtext is, how important the deeper message is. Things can't just resolve with a couple of fireworks and a catchy tune, because that would break the narrative. Instead, Part 2 handles the repercussions of Part 1 in a smart way while still delivering an entertaining surface level movie. But, having said all that, it doesn't do everything right. This movie runs into problems mainly with wasted plot points that are tedious length buffers, have tired easy resolutions, or that just have no business being in the film at all. And I just can't shake the feeling that if they had been a bit more poised on the film's back half, then we've got something potentially all-time great. And a ton of it is just a detraction from the bigger plot, not a meaningful side story that adds to the plot as Lonnie's involvement does. Plus, some moments that needed a bit more fine-tuned execution just missed the mark, sometimes in facepalm-inducing ways. See again Gaston's son awkwardly rattling off Beauty and the Beast details to Ben. That's an issue the first film would have, but it's more jarring now because they almost completely fixed that here, so it's that much worse. But honestly, if you're already down with the main concepts and ideas of this world, then you're in for a fun ride, and small errors like these won't really spoil it for you. All in all, I had a singular hope for Descendants 2, to be a better movie than Descendants. From the soundtrack, to the character arcs, to the social subtext, to the minor technical details, to the bigger moments, to the realizations and resolutions, I think Kenny Ortega accomplished that goal. It's not quite a grand slam, but from where I'm standing, it's at least an RBI double. And maybe that's partly a result of me not coming in with much faith, but I mean, hey, I'm only human. It's fun, it's important, it functions surprisingly well as a sequel, and in my opinion, well worth a watch, or a rewatch. But, as I always say, the only way to know for sure is to watch it yourself and then decide for yourself. And as always, thanks for watching.